The sound that changed everything wasn't dramatic. It was the soft ping of a notification at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, while I was still in my pajamas pouring my first cup of coffee. I remember the exact time because I had just glanced at the microwave clock, thinking I had exactly 40 minutes before I needed to leave for work. My name is Hazel Drummond. I'm 31 years old, a licensed occupational therapist working at a rehabilitation center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had spent 6 years grinding through patient caseloads, weekend certifications, and the kind of professional exhaustion that makes you question everything at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. And 3 days before that Tuesday morning, my supervisor had told me I was being promoted to department lead, along with a salary adjustment that would bring me to just over $94,000 a year. I had cried in my car afterward, not from sadness, just from relief. The quiet, bone-deep relief of knowing that something had finally worked out. The notification was from my brother. "Congratulations, sis. Heard the news from Mom. We need to talk soon. Call me." I stood there holding my coffee mug, reading it twice. Something about the word need sat wrong. Not want to celebrate, not so proud of you, need. I texted back that I was free after 7 that evening. Then I finished getting ready for work, told myself I was overthinking it, and tried to leave the feeling at the door. I couldn't. That evening, my brother called at exactly 7:03. His voice carried the particular tone he used when he had rehearsed something in advance, measured and careful, like a contractor estimating a job before he names the price. He said Mom and Dad had been talking. He said things had been tight lately, that the house in Greensboro needed a new roof, that Dad's back had been worse this year, that medical bills were starting to stack. He said they weren't asking for much, just something to help them get through. He said the number they had in mind was $2,000 a month. I set my phone on the kitchen counter without hanging up and stared at the wall for a few seconds. $2,000 a month. Not once. Monthly. Indefinitely. I picked the phone back up. I told him I needed time to think. He said he understood that there was no rush, but that Mom and Dad were really counting on me. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, that I was the only one in the family who could actually help. After we hung up, I sat on the floor of my kitchen, back against the cabinet, and let myself feel whatever that was. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something more like the slow realization that a room you thought was safe had a door you didn't know about, and someone had just walked through it. If you've ever had someone you love make you feel guilty for something you worked years to earn, stay with me until the end. What happened next took me places I never expected a family conversation to go. My parents had lived in the same house in Greensboro for 22 years. My father worked in HVAC until his early retirement at 62. My mother had spent decades as a church secretary, and they had always presented their life as one of modest but comfortable stability. 2 cars. A vegetable garden in the backyard. Annual trips to Myrtle Beach. They were not people I had ever associated with financial desperation. But I also knew that my brother, who was 34 and had never held a job longer than 2 years, still lived with them. Had lived with them since he dropped out of his second attempt at community college at 26, and in the years since they had quietly folded his expenses into their own, paying his phone bill, his car insurance, covering his portion of takeout every time the family gathered. I had watched it happen and said nothing, because it wasn't my house and it wasn't my money, but apparently, now it was going to be. I called my aunt the next morning, my mother's older sister, who lived 40 minutes outside of Charlotte, near Lake Norman, and who had always had an unnerving ability to see through things quickly. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Hazel, that's not a request, that's a plan." I asked her what she meant. She said she had seen something similar happen to a woman in her church circle years ago, an adult daughter who had received a small inheritance and whose siblings had immediately circled with expectations dressed up as need. She said the framing of it always followed the same shape. Start with sympathy, establish urgency, name a number before the other person has time to think clearly. I thought about the word need in my brother's first text. The way he had called at exactly 7 o'clock, the fact that they already had a number. I thanked my aunt and told her I would handle it carefully. She said she hoped so, and then she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. You don't owe anyone an apology for being good at what you do. I decided to go see my parents in person the following Saturday. I wanted to look at their faces when we talked. I wanted to understand what was actually happening before I made any decisions. I brought a casserole because that's what you do in my family. You bring food to soften whatever comes next. The visit started normally enough. My mother hugged me at the door and my father was sitting in his usual recliner watching the pre-game show. My brother was nowhere around, which I noted. The casserole went into the oven and we sat in the living room making the small talk that families make when everyone knows a larger conversation is waiting in the next room. My father brought it up first. He didn't ease into it. He looked at me directly and said they were proud of me, that they always knew I would do well, and that now that I was doing well, they hoped I would remember where I came from. I asked him to tell me specifically what they needed. My mother leaned forward. She explained that the roof estimate had come in at $18,000. She said my father's back injections weren't fully covered by Medicare Part B. She mentioned that groceries had gotten expensive, that utilities were up, that they were just struggling to keep everything afloat. I asked quietly about the rental property. The room went still. 3 years earlier, my parents had bought a small house 2 streets over as an investment, renting it out to a young couple. It brought in $1,100 a month. I knew about it because my mother had mentioned it proudly at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, calling it their retirement cushion. My father said the rental had been difficult lately, that tenants were unreliable, that the income wasn't stable. I asked if the current tenants were paying. He said yes, but that wasn't really the point. I told them I loved them, that I wanted to support them in ways that made sense, but that committing to $2,000 a month wasn't something I could do without understanding the full picture. I asked if we could look at their actual budget together. My mother's expression shifted in a way I recognized from childhood. The particular tightening around her eyes that meant the conversation had gone somewhere she hadn't planned for. My brother showed up an hour later, which surprised me since his truck hadn't been in the driveway. He came in through the back door and sat down at the kitchen table without acknowledging that he had been absent. At some point during the conversation that followed, he said something that I've replayed many times since. He said, "You make almost $100,000 a year, you live alone, you don't have kids. What exactly are you spending it on?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the student loans I had paid off the year before. I thought about the 6 years of building an emergency fund. The retirement contributions I had started at 24 because no one in my family had taught me to, and I had to figure it out alone. I thought about the fact that I had never once asked either of my parents for a single dollar after I left for college. I didn't say any of that. I finished my coffee, told them I would think about everything, and drove home. The drive back to Charlotte takes about 90 minutes. I spent the first 30 minutes just breathing. 4 days later, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was from the Guilford County Clerk of Courts. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building and opened it with my thumb, the way you open things when you're trying to be calm. Inside was a formal notice. My parents had filed a petition under North Carolina General Statute 14-326.1, the statute that allows parents to seek financial support from adult children in cases of demonstrated need. I had never heard of that law before that moment. I sat in my car for a long time. That night I called my aunt. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened, and then she said I needed a lawyer before I did anything else. No calls to my parents. No texts to my brother. Nothing that could be used as an admission of anything. She gave me the name of a woman she knew, a family law attorney who had handled estate disputes and support cases for 20 years and who had a reputation for being, in my aunt's exact words, ruthlessly organized. Her name was the attorney. We met at her office in Uptown Charlotte 2 days later. She was in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a yellow legal pad covered in notes before I had even finished explaining the situation. She told me that the statute my parents had invoked was rarely used and rarely successful, but that it wasn't toothless either. Courts had occasionally ruled in favor of parents who could demonstrate genuine indigence and a child with clear financial capacity. She said the key word was genuine. She asked me to pull together everything, My pay stubs, my tax returns for the last 3 years, my bank statements, my student loan payoff records, my retirement account statements. She wanted the complete financial picture of someone who had built stability entirely on their own. Then she started asking about my parents. I told her about the rental property. She wrote that down immediately. I told her about my father's HVAC pension, which I knew existed because he had referenced it more than once over the years. She wrote that down too. I told her about the Social Security both of my parents received, which I calculated based on what I knew of their work histories, and about the fact that my brother lived with them and contributed nothing. She looked up from her legal pad. Their rental income alone may invalidate their claim of indigence, she said. We're going to need documentation of that. I reached out to my aunt, who knew people in Greensboro in the way that women of a certain generation know everyone. Within a week, we had a copy of the publicly available rental listing for the property from 2 years prior, the county tax record showing my parents as the owners, and a property management database that confirmed the address had been continuously occupied. Meanwhile, my attorney filed for discovery. She requested my parents' full financial disclosures, bank records, income documentation, and a complete accounting of their monthly expenses. What came back was incomplete in ways that weren't accidental. The rental income appeared nowhere. The HVAC pension was listed at a lower figure than what my father had casually mentioned to relatives over the years. There were expenses listed that my attorney flagged immediately as inflated, including a line item for my brother's medical support that had no corresponding documentation. She called me after reviewing everything. Her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who has seen this before. They've misrepresented their financial situation to the court, she said. That's a significant problem for their case, and possibly for them personally. I asked what she meant. She said that submitting false financial information in a support proceeding could constitute fraud on the court. Judges took that seriously. She said she intended to raise it. 3 weeks before the hearing date, I received a text from my brother. It was long, the kind of text that starts with, "I just want you to know," and ends somewhere it was never supposed to go. He told me I was tearing the family apart. He told me that our parents had given up so much for me, and that I was throwing it back in their faces. He told me that everyone in the family was talking about what I was doing. I screenshot it and sent it to my attorney with a single line, adding to the file. She replied, "Good." The night before the hearing, my aunt drove to Charlotte and stayed at my apartment. She didn't bring anything except herself and a container of homemade soup, which was exactly right. We sat at my kitchen table talking about things that had nothing to do with courts or petitions, about her garden, about a trip she was planning to see her college roommate in Savannah. At some point, close to midnight, she put her hand over mine and said she would be there in the morning, and that was all she said. The hearing was held at the Guilford County Courthouse in Greensboro on a Thursday in early April. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with fluorescent lighting and wood-paneled walls the color of weak tea. My attorney sat beside me, her legal pad already open, a row of highlighted documents arranged by tab. My parents arrived with my brother. My father wore a button-down shirt I recognized from family photos. My mother had dressed carefully, the kind of careful that is meant to be noticed. They sat at the petitioner's table without looking at me. The judge was a woman, perhaps mid-60s, with short silver hair and the expression of someone who had heard every variation of every story and had no patience for the ones that wasted her time. My mother spoke first. Her voice trembled in a way that was hard to read from the outside if you didn't know her. She described their situation in terms of sacrifice and devotion. She talked about putting me through childhood, about the values they had instilled, about how painful it was to feel abandoned by a daughter who had the means to help and chose not to. She cried at the end. My brother handed her a tissue. My attorney stood when the judge invited her to respond. She was precise and brief. She noted that the petitioners owned investment real estate generating over $13,000 annually in rental income. She noted the HVAC pension. She noted the combined Social Security benefits. She presented the property tax records, the rental history documentation, and the inconsistencies between the disclosed financial statements and the actual documented income. Then she placed a single document on the judge's bench. It was a letter, written in my mother's own handwriting, dated 14 months prior, addressed to my aunt. In it, my mother described the rental property as their best decision in years and mentioned they were considering purchasing a second one. My attorney said nothing further. She sat down. The judge looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at my parents. She asked my father directly about the pension amount listed in his disclosure versus what the public employment record showed. There was a long pause. He said he might have made an error. The judge set her pen down. She said the court had reviewed the petition and the evidence submitted by both parties. She said that the statute in question required demonstrated indigence, meaning genuine inability to meet basic needs, and that the financial documentation before her did not support that finding. She said the petitioners had income from multiple sources, sufficient to cover reasonable living expenses. She said that furthermore, the discrepancies in the financial disclosures were of serious concern to the court. She dismissed the petition. She also ordered my parents to pay my legal fees, citing the misrepresentation of their financial situation. The gavel came down once, cleanly. My attorney gathered her papers with the quiet efficiency of someone who had expected exactly this outcome. I sat very still for a moment, my hands flat on the table the way they had been all morning, and I let out one long, slow breath. When I stood, I didn't look at my parents. I followed my attorney out of the courtroom and into the hallway, where the fluorescent light felt slightly less harsh, or maybe I just felt slightly less tense. My aunt was waiting on a bench near the exit. When she saw my face, she stood up and opened her arms, and I walked into that hug like I was 12 years old again, and that was fine. In the weeks after the hearing, I went back to my regular life in Charlotte with the strange feeling of someone who has been in a minor accident and is still checking themselves for injuries that aren't there. I went to work. I saw my patients. I made coffee in the morning and did laundry on Sunday nights and went to the farmer's market near my building on weekends. Everything was ordinary. That was the part that surprised me most. People at work were kind. A colleague who had known something was going on, though I had never told her exactly what, left a card on my desk one afternoon that said simply, "Glad you're still standing." My supervisor, during a routine check-in, mentioned she'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that there had been some family difficulty and that if I ever needed flexibility in my schedule I should just ask. She asked nothing more, and I respected her for it. The legal fees ruling had apparently shaken things loose. My aunt told me, about 6 weeks later, that my parents had retained a mediator of some kind, that my brother had finally taken a job at a logistics company, that the house in Greensboro had been refinanced. She told me this in the gentle way she shared information as context rather than gossip, letting me decide what to do with it. I did nothing with it. There was nothing to do. My mother sent me a text in May. It was 11 words. "I hope you know how much damage you've done to this family." I read it once, put my phone face down on my desk, and went back to the discharge notes I was writing. I didn't respond. I didn't feel the sharp pull I would have felt a year ago. The urgent need to fix it, or explain myself, or make her understand. I just felt tired. And then I felt nothing in particular, and then I finished my notes and went to lunch. That was the thing no one tells you about situations like this. The aftermath isn't dramatic. There's no scene where everyone gathers and truth is spoken and relationships are repaired or finally severed with ceremony. It's just Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and you keep going. My aunt and I talk every Sunday now. We started the habit during everything that was happening, and it never stopped. She asks about my patients, in the way that respects privacy while still being genuinely curious about my work. I ask about her garden, which she documents obsessively with a disposable camera she gets developed at the drugstore because she distrusts cloud storage. It's a small thing. It matters more than anything that came before it. I did eventually have a conversation with a financial planner, something I had been meaning to do for 2 years and kept postponing. I told her about my goals, paying off my car by end of year, building 6 months of liquid savings, eventually buying a condo near the South End neighborhood where I like to run on weekend mornings. She laid out a plan that felt manageable. Possible. Mine. There's a specific weight that lifts when you realize the story you've been told about yourself. That you owe something. That your success is a collective resource available for others to draw from. That your boundaries are selfishness dressed up in ingratitude. That story isn't true. It was never true. You just heard it so many times from people whose voices carried so much authority that you forgot you were allowed to disagree. I think about that first notification sometimes. The soft ping at 7:14 in the morning, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. I think about the word need and how I had known instantly that something was wrong, and how I had talked myself out of knowing it, because knowing it was uncomfortable. I don't talk myself out of things anymore. Or, I try not to. What I know now, that I didn't know a year ago, is that protecting what you've built isn't the same as abandoning the people you love. You can love your family and still refuse to be the solution to problems you didn't create. You can grieve a relationship without pretending the relationship was what you needed it to be. And you can stand in a courthouse hallway on a Thursday morning, step into a hug from the one person who showed up, and feel something very close to free. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a verdict or a ruling or a gavel strike. It arrives later, quietly, on an ordinary morning when you pour your coffee and realize that the notification sound doesn't make your chest tighten anymore. That you're not waiting for something to go wrong. That the life you built, carefully and alone, is just your life now. That's enough. It turns out it was always enough. If this story touched something you recognize, leave a comment below. I read every one of them. And if you know someone who's been made to feel guilty for simply having the courage to succeed, share this with them. Like and subscribe for more stories about the quiet, unglamorous, real kind of strength it takes to choose yourself. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this. Not in a bitter way, just in the way you examine something after it's over, turning it over in your hands to understand its shape. My brother spent a decade making choices that kept him small. Not because he was incapable, but because he was never asked to be anything else. Every time a consequence showed up at the door, someone softened it. Every time discomfort arrived, it was quietly removed. That kind of life doesn't build anything. It just borrows against the future until the future runs out. And when it did run out, they didn't look inward. They looked at me. That's the part I had to sit with for a long time, the fact that my success, the thing I had worked toward through 6 years of clinical rotations and student loan payments and Sunday nights studying for certifications nobody asked me to get, became something that made me a target. It wasn't fair, but I also think fairness is the wrong lens for understanding what happened. What actually happened was cause and effect, plain and simple. My parents chose to carry my brother's life on their backs without asking anything of him, and eventually that weight broke something in their finances and in their judgment. When people are desperate, they reach for whatever is closest. I happen to be closest. The petition, the misrepresented documents, the text from my brother accusing me of tearing the family apart. All of it was the logical end of a chain that started long before I got that promotion. And my choices had their own chain. I chose to build carefully. I chose to live within my means for years when it would have been easier not to. I chose to call a lawyer instead of sending an angry text at midnight. I chose to let my aunt sit with me the night before the hearing instead of white-knuckling it alone. Those choices compounded quietly. The same way the other choices had compounded, just in the opposite direction. I think that's what people mean when they talk about integrity without ever quite defining it. It's not one dramatic moment. It's the accumulation of small decisions that nobody applauds, made consistently, over time, when it would be just as easy to cut corners. Hazel at 24 opening her first retirement account. Hazel at 28 paying an extra $100 a month toward her loans. Hazel at 31 sitting in a lawyer's office with 6 years of clean financial records that told an honest story. Those weren't heroic acts. They were just habits. And those habits saved me in a way that no argument or confrontation ever could have. What I want to say to anyone watching this who recognizes something in my story is this. The work you do on yourself, the quiet discipline of showing up and building something real, it isn't wasted even when it makes you a target. Especially then, because when people try to take from you what you've built, the truth of how you built it is the only defense that actually holds. My aunt told me once that courage has a long memory. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I think I do now. Every hard choice I made in the years before any of this happened remembered itself when I needed it most. That's not luck. That's just what happens when you refuse to take shortcuts with your own life.